going to suggest that we move the next 4 items as a single motion. To approve the lease agreement between Seligson Properties and Norwalk Public Schools in conjunction with the City of Norwalk, approve execution of sublease between Norwalk Public Schools, City of Norwalk, and First Student, approve services agreement with First Student for Type 1 school bus, and approve services agreement with First Student ECS Related Transportation Services for Type 2. Is there a motion to approve those 4 items? Mr. Barbas moves, Ms. Keys seconds. Mr. Rudel, give us the lowdown.
As we put together our budget and we looked for opportunities for improvements, efficiencies, savings, one of the areas that we looked into was transportation. Currently, under the existing contract that expires June 30th, the Norwalk Public Schools actually pays one of the higher Type 1 rates for Type 1 buses. And one of the reasons for that is the lack of competition within Norwalk. And part of that is due to the fact that Norwalk does not have a bus depot. So working with Tom Hamilton in the city, we looked at a number of sites to see whether or not Norwalk can have a bus depot for itself. There are not a lot of areas within Norwalk that are zoned, but there is a bus depot currently on Wilson Avenue that First Student currently leases directly. The issue when a vendor leases with a site, they're only going to lease on a short-term basis, because if they lose the contract, they obviously don't want to be stuck with the property. The shorter the term lease, the less advantageous it is financially for you. First Student passes off the cost onto the Norwalk Public Schools directly, which is one of the reasons why we pay a high Type 1 rate. So in negotiations with Stanley Seligson of Seligson Property, we looked at ways in which the city could lease it. And since the city has a AAA bond rating, it's on very strong financial footing, it allowed us to offer have a lease for a longer period of time with much greater financial savings to the district. So when we put out the RFP, we put out the RFP in 2 ways. One in which the district had a bus depot, and one in which the district would require the vendor to find their own bus depot, essentially. The differences were pretty dramatic. Over a course of a 5-year contract, the savings to the Norwalk Public Schools is actually $1.1 million. The current contract that we have calls for 4.5% increases each year for Type 1 buses, which is pretty dramatic. In negotiations with First Student and the other vendors, the recommendation for First Student actually calls for an increase of less than 1% from the current year to the next year, and then increases of 2.5%, 2.5%, 2.75%, and 2.75%. The other big issue for Norwalk is we have a very old fleet of buses. Buses that range from 100,000 to 125,000 miles on individual buses. So we really wanted to upgrade the fleet within this RFP. So currently we have 52 Type 1 buses. So this agreement calls for 42 brand new buses. All the buses would have GPS and cameras on the buses. The other 10 buses, while would be used, the maximum amount of miles on the bus can only be 100,000 miles, whereas the current contract calls for a maximum amount of miles of 125,000 miles. The first year savings for next year, just from having the bus depot, is about $184,000. For Type 2 buses, these are the buses that really support special education students who are outplaced. We recommended 3 vendors, both First Student, who's doing our Type 1 buses, but also ECS and Relia. We are currently using ECS and Relia. The reason we really wanted 3 vendors was with the growing number of outplacements, the uncertainty of how many outplacements, it really gives us a little bit more flexibility in how we could have routes. It gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of who we can issue routes to. There's also a fair financial savings. The contract calls for about 3.1% increases over a 5-year contract, which is down from the current contract. I have with me Joanna Zanvetter, who is our coordinator of transportation, as well as Karen Bartron, who's our purchasing agent. I did bring them here because they work very, very hard on this contract. And it's really a contract that's very, very good for the school system. Not only does it save over $1 million over 5 years, it upgrades the fleet of buses that we have. And it really gives us a little bit more flexibility than we had in the past. Having a bus contract currently, where it calls for 4.5% increases, makes it very difficult to add a new bus when enrollment goes up. If you only have if you have an overall budget where your budget's going up 2% or 2.5%, when you have a line item that's going up almost 5%, and then you have to add a bus that could cost, let's say, $80,000, it makes it very difficult to balance your budget. So bringing in those costs and those annual year-over-year increases down were pretty big win for the school system.
Well, I'd like to compliment Rich and the coordinators there on transportation for doing this. Jim commented earlier on how we've dramatically increased by $1 million a year the reimbursements that we're getting for Medicaid by having an active staff that's actually out looking for ways to do stuff like that. And this is another example, and I'm very pleased that we have people who are not, kicking off their shoes and sitting back in their office and drawing their paycheck. I mean, you guys are eating the hustings and finding out really creative ways of saving us money that both helps the taxpayers and also gives us more funding for students. So I think it's a terrific job. My compliments. Any questions, comments, Mike?
Just one question. I think you touched on this, Rich, but I didn't completely follow. I know we had to add a bus this last year because of these new developments. Zoning approves all these developments, but then we never get paid our share. We have to absorb all these students. And I think it was $80,000 to add a bus.
It's about 80,000.
So what going, we know our enrollment looks like it's going to continue growing. We're building more and more of these apartments. Is that still the same cost if we have to?
Well, the cost of a bus is based on the daily rate times the amount of days in the school year, so like 181 days. So while the increase will be about 2.5%, before we were paying every year, you had to have basically a 4.5% increase over and above your daily rate. So the growth rate with for a new bus
It's going to be less.
Okay.
But it would still be 80,000 roughly, growing at 2.5% a year in rough terms.
Okay, anything else? All right, hearing none, we'll proceed to a vote. All in favor of approving these 4 agenda items, please indicate. And it is unanimous. Well done. Thank you.